So I'm very happy to announce Yanya Viskovich here as our closing keynote. We only just met a couple of weeks ago when I was still looking for a closing keynote, and time was running out, and then I had a perfect match. She's going to present exactly what we needed. I saw her speak, and I know that she's been a TEDx speaker in Zurich, and I thought she needs an audience in Bern as well. And she will wrap up our day and why the human factor is so essential and how you cannot fix humans. You better fix your computer. Thanks very much. Welcome, Yanya.
Say yes and put your hand up if you've ever made a mistake. Not bad. I know there are a lot of CISOs in the room, but that's a lot of perfect people. So let's try this once again. Say yes and put your hand up if you've ever made a mistake. That's more realistic. Now think about the last time you made a mistake that might have led to a bad outcome. Got it? Okay, now turn to the person beside you and tell them they're really stupid for making a mistake and that bad outcome would never have happened if it wasn't for them. Go on, try it. How did that make you feel? Did it make you feel uncomfortable? A little bit embarrassed? I bet you didn't want to tell anyone, right? My name is Yanya Viskovich, and in my 17-year career, I've worked on cybersecurity and data protection and data ethics from various angles. I started out in Australia prosecuting cyber criminals and stuff on the dark web and working with law enforcement agencies. And after 6 years at the bar in Australia, I took a career change. I went to work for the United Nations and ended up doing various things for them, including strategizing crisis contingency plans in Lebanon during the height of the Syria crisis, developing the UN's first data protection policy, anti-fraud programs, and so forth. I've worked for the International Committee of the Red Cross, so I take the points from our last speaker, and then have also developed data protection programs for large multinationals in the engineering and technology space. And today, I specialize in helping organizations, CISOs, C-suites, boards, to manage their human cyber risk. So on Saturday, I was at a party, and I was explaining to the host why I had to leave early. I said, look, I've got a talk I've got to give on Tuesday, and I got to leave early. And he said, what are you speaking on? And I said, cybersecurity. And all of a sudden, I saw his eyes glaze over. So I quickly got in. I said, but I'm speaking about the human element. And he's like, okay, so like, what do you mean? Like how humans hack into computers? I said, yeah, like sometimes we humans, we've probably all written our passwords down on a piece of paper at some stage, or in a notebook, or on our computers, maybe on a Post-it note. And he said, yeah, I do that. I've got all my passwords on my Notes app in my iPhone. And he said, and I have a password for that note, so it's pretty secure. And he looked pretty proud of himself. And I jokingly said, so if I can crack that first passcode, I've got access to all the others. And then he laughed and he realized his mistake. He's like, yeah, you know what? Actually, now that I think about it, it's a pretty easy one to crack. Being human means making mistakes. In the early 1700s, there was a poet called Alexander Pope, and he lent a famous line from one of his essays to a report on patient safety in hospitals by the US Institutes of Medicine. To err is human, he wrote. He left out the remainder of the line from his poem, which was to forgive divine, which is a shame because it would have further reinforced the report's message that instead of blaming and punishing the nurses and doctors for making mistakes in their fatigued states, they needed to look at the hospital system. The glaring problem, the report found, was preventable patient deaths in hospitals. And 300 years later, the same institute's report on patient safety in 1999 again revealed that over 100,000 people were dying each year from preventable causes in hospitals. The magnitude of the problem was unmasked, and the report served as both a tipping and a turning point for ushering in an era of openness, and a dramatic change occurred. Because the focus was taken off blaming individuals, it led to a closer examination of healthcare systems and how they fail us. And in turn, this has meant that fewer of us now die in hospitals. In fact, research by renowned organizational psychologists, particularly Amy Edmondson from the US, has found that in hospitals, where individuals feel safe to speak up, to share their concerns, and contribute their ideas without fear or retribution, patient safety and overall healthcare improves as nurses and surgeons are more likely to report errors, discuss improvements, and collaborate effectively. Without this concept of psychological safety, issues tend to be hidden, concealed, and critical improvements are delayed, which jeopardizes both healthcare providers and their patients. Without psychological safety, critical improvements are delayed. And because the healthcare system is designed by humans, as long as humans are involved, error is inevitable. Overconfidence, tunnel vision, bias, prejudice, inconsistency, these cause uncertainty and unpredictability, and inevitably, error and mistakes. Which is why this surgical practice is now commonplace. And even though it's extremely effective, it's just one protocol in a system of many safety measures. Because, well, sometimes unexpected things happen. This is a photo of a 2-year-old child who was admitted to have her left leg amputated. When she was in the preoperative area, her thigh was clearly marked. A permanent marker pen was used to draw an arrow and a smiling face and to write the surgeon's initials, as is common surgical protocol. But when she arrived in the operating room, it appeared that both legs had been marked for amputation. So standard protocols had been followed, but when she was resting in the preoperative area, the marker from one thigh had transferred to the other. So in the operating room, the surgeons confirmed the surgical site from notes, parental consent forms, and preoperative radiographs. Multiple safety measures were and should be implemented to avoid surgical mistakes, just like we have in layered defense in depth in security. Because indeed, humans make mistakes. We are not perfect. Well, not all of us. And guess what? Our error rates go up when we're stressed, tired, overwhelmed, frustrated, when we're multitasking, and when we're afraid. I bet many of us work in organizations or have worked in organizations where we're required to follow processes that drive us absolutely mad. And we think, what the hell is this serving? What's the purpose of this? Those friction-causing processes, they cause workarounds. And those workarounds erode your security culture. And guess what? That digital transformation that your organization has been on since COVID-19 hit, Well, change creates fear, and fear makes people more inclined to make mistakes. Because mistakes, frustration, fear, and violations lead to successful cyber attacks, my question to you is this: how is your security strategy and your security program tackling this? Because over 80% of all successful cyber incidents involve the human factor. So we have a problem in cybersecurity, and it's probably not what you think. Let me explain. In the late 1900s, the American cryptographer Bruce Schneier popularized the PPT framework. It was a method to help businesses find the right balance between people, processes, and technology, three critical components to increase output, lower costs, and make better use of organizations' resources and manage our entire operations. It's sometimes referred to as a three-legged stool. If one leg is taller or shorter or non-existent, the entire stool will tip over. Each of those legs is important in their own right, and when they're interconnected, they complement each other to create a symbiotic method of business management. Schneier was trying to push the idea that people and processes needed to be incorporated into an overall security system because, as he wrote back in 2013, security back then was largely technology only. It's almost as if the 90s has come back in fashion. In the years since, Schneier has revised his support for this framework. He wrote, "The IT security world has become so complicated that we need less in the way of people and process and more technology. The golden triangle has to be rebalanced," he said, in favor of automation. "Today, I ditch the triangle. It's become an argument against excessive technology, and that's what we now need." I think organizations have heeded his advice. Today, security investments continue to be disproportionately weighted in favor of technology, and in recent years, on automating previously manual processes, with little to no focus on the processes that facilitate efficient utilization or the people that use it, other than to condescendingly refer to us as users and the weakest link in the chain. And by the way, that damaging phrase can also be attributed to Bruce Schneier, who wrote in 2000 in one of his books. And yet, despite this excessive focus on technology, where software eats world, the security landscape has arguably not improved over time. On the contrary, attack surfaces have expanded and become more complex. Threats have morphed, new technologies are weaponized by cyber criminals, as we heard Eva talk about in the opening. And many wide-scale digital transformation processes have created further vulnerabilities, especially as many of them fail to gain employee buy-in, minimize security-induced friction, and maximize control adoption. Unfortunately, in the majority of organizations, we security leaders have restricted our focus to the obvious and tangible, positioning technology in our security strategies and programs as a cure-all for all of security's problems. But technology is no panacea. In the 2 decades since Schneier implored organizations to focus on technology, the golden triangle is less equilateral, more obtuse, as new technologies continue to be introduced. And yet, we're left with that telling statistic that the overwhelming majority of our cyber attacks involve the human element. That is, threat actors exploiting vulnerabilities in technology by preying on human vulnerabilities. So what can we do? Did anyone take a plane to get here? Okay. Well, thanks to remarkable advancements in the aviation industry over the last 40 years, you took the safest form of transport. And by the way, for those of you who drove, you took the most dangerous. The airline industry has achieved this remarkable accomplishment thanks to modern technology and engineering, as well as regulations being stringent and standards. But principally, it's achieved this by applying a safety-critical approach that is designed for humans and takes into consideration how we interact and behave in complex systems. The safety-critical approach involves multiple layers of safety nets, often referred to as defense in depth, the same concept, as I mentioned, that's considered best practice in security. And this safety-critical approach in the aviation industry has many valuable lessons that I believe we can apply in cybersecurity. You might recognize this image. Captain Sullenberger, is the famed pilot who successfully landed this plane carrying all 159, I think, passengers after his engines failed when a flock of birds flew into the engines. He'd called ahead to the air traffic control tower and told them of his issue and said, "I need you to clear the Hudson River so that I can land this plane safely." And in an interview after the incident, he said, "We finally got beyond blaming pilots in aviation for accidents, and now we have a formal lessons learned process. It comes up with probable causes, with contributing factors. It makes recommendations to the rule makers and to industry about how to prevent this from happening again. A part of what we have done is transformed the culture of aviation from a blame-based system to a learning-based system." And a few weeks after the crash, it was revealed that he'd left a library book in the cockpit titled "Just Culture: Balancing Safety and Accountability." He'd been reading about establishing an effective safety culture by balancing accountability with learning. You'll be pleased to know that the library didn't impose any late fines when he called them to tell them that the waterlogged book was available. This learning-based system that Captain Sully was referring to involves rigorous measures that have been evolved to ensure the safety of flight operations. It's human-centric because it prioritizes our role as humans in this process, and it recognizes that human performance is central to safety and designing systems and procedures accordingly to minimize the potential for errors. It takes a systems approach and focuses on two closely related outcomes: performance and well-being. Which is why today, following scientific discoveries about how humans make decisions poorly when overloaded with information, the number of instruments in cockpits today has been significantly reduced, and the display of information is designed for the human eye. In aviation, in engineering, they consider human capabilities and limitations when designing aircraft equipment and procedures. This includes the cockpit layout, control systems, user interfaces, as I mentioned, that are optimized for human use. Crew resource management emphasizes effective communication and teamwork among flight crews, and it acknowledges that human errors can occur and provides training to address them when the shit hits the fan. It begins with rigorous pilot training and certification programs that emphasize error identification and mitigation. Pilots are trained to recognize their own human limitations. They understand the systems they operate in. They communicate effectively in high-pressure situations. Their training includes simulations and recurring evaluations. They also are required to undergo training in human factors. Now imagine how we might transform cybersecurity if people were trained to recognize human limitations and how normal aspects of being human increase our attack surface, and if we regularly conducted cyber crisis simulations and practiced communicating with each other during a cyber attack. I'm not saying that all of our cyber threats would disappear if we adopt this safety-critical approach, but I am saying that how we respond to cyber incidents would improve, and in turn, so too would our cyber resilience. Because I believe, and I think the research shows, that our organizational resilience turns heavily on individual resilience. Recognizing the impact of fatigue on human performance, aviation regulators have put in place rest requirements for pilots because they know that it's important to manage fatigue and prevent fatigue-related errors. Let me ask you CISOs out there, how many of you and your SOC teams are getting the required 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night? How many of you feel ready to manage a crisis now, in the ordinary course of your duties? If we're already burnt out before we're managing a crisis, we have a big problem. In fact, the problem is so big that actually Gartner has predicted that by 2025, a quarter of all cybersecurity leaders will leave this profession entirely due to workplace stress and burnout. When we contrast this safety-critical approach adopted in aviation to cybersecurity, I am struck by the fact that 40% of CISOs will be fired after navigating their companies through a data breach. And how most people are referred to condescendingly, as I mentioned earlier, as users or the weakest link in the chain. And how so many organizations don't have organizational cultures that encourage people to speak up and tell about something that they're concerned about. And how so many of our organizations punish people for being human, for having our emotions appealed to and accidentally clicking on a phishing link as a result, as we saw Christina allude to earlier. The combination of this safety-critical systems approach, having a just culture, which is looking at root cause analysis of incidents, and recognition that human error is a central factor in accidents, has driven the aviation industry's progress over the last 40 years. It's embraced the philosophy that perfection is unattainable, and thus the system should be designed to accommodate the inevitable human error. It's this approach that's reduced human error in aviation, and it serves as a guiding light for us in cybersecurity to rebalance that golden triangle I mentioned earlier. By acknowledging the inevitability of human error and implementing human cyber risk considerations in our security strategies and programs, we can greatly enhance the security of our digital systems. Because the systems we build and operate will always be vulnerable to errors and attacks. Take the Colonial Pipeline attack, for example. This was not a sophisticated zero-day bug. Anyone know how the attackers got in? Well, I tell you, it came down to a very simple human error. So the cyber criminal that hacked into Colonial Pipeline, they didn't develop code. They rented ransomware code from a criminal ransomware as a service actor. And they used that to breach and hold Colonial Pipeline hostage. How did they get in? Well, Colonial HR forgot to tell Colonial IT that a former employee should be deactivated from the system. Multi-factor authentication had not been enabled, and a process that could have been automated was not. So all it took for this cybercriminal group to hold Colonial Pipeline systems hostage and almost grind the American economy to a halt was that stolen credential on the dark web from a former employee, who, by the way, had used it on a personal device. And what you might know, and this is just a side note, is that a confidential Department of Energy assessment found that the US could only have afforded 3 more days of Colonial Pipeline being down before it ground the entire American economy to a halt. And it wasn't because they wouldn't have had access to oil and gas. It was because manufacturing sites would not have had access to diesel for their engines. 3 days. So recognizing that errors, mistakes, and attacks are inevitable, we have to design security systems and programs with humans in mind, with defense in-depth approaches that consider how we have evolved over millennia, and we heard David refer to that earlier, how we have evolved to behave. Eva pointed out in her opening keynote that we must design our technology, our devices, our systems, our programs for humans. And I'm sure we completely agree with her. In cybersecurity, this means combining effective user training and awareness with organizational cultures that support the behaviors that we want our employees to adopt. And combining that with robust technical defenses, but also deploying and designing software for humans, not in spite of them, and making our security processes as frictionless and easy as possible. Because humans are like water. We find the easiest course to something. Like in aviation, in cybersecurity, we need to shift from a mindset of foolproof systems and software to fail-safe ones. And implementing just cultures in our organizations can be applied in cybersecurity as well. When employees feel safe enough to put up their hand and say, I think I've fallen victim to a social engineering attack. I think I've just clicked on a phishing link. We foster a culture of learning from mistakes and improving our security systems in the course. In our organizations, that means fostering environments where asking difficult questions is not considered a radical act. On average, it takes 297 days for a data breach to be remediated and discovered in an organization's system. And I really wonder, can we reduce that dwell time by making people feel safe enough to report errors, to report concerns, to say, yeah, I've messed up. And we as security leaders, we can lead the charge. We can admit our mistakes and failures in front of our teams and encourage them to do the same and build psychological safety in the process. We can talk about and train people on the human factor, just as they do with pilots in aviation. We can practice for contingencies by regularly carrying out simulations and tabletop exercises and seeing where our processes and our communication with our teammates breaks down in a moment of crisis. We can encourage HR, legal and compliance to remove punishments for people who fail phishing and security awareness tests. We can implement just cultures in our organizations that take a root cause analysis approach to incident investigations. And we can enshrine this in our organizations by encouraging legal and compliance to write it into our code of business conduct policies that employers are expected to speak up and that they will be treated favorably when they do so. And in that way, they can point to a policy when it does happen and say, see, you told me I have to do this. Instead of focusing on technology, we need to be looking at better ways to understand the characteristics of human performance in security. Thinking, feeling, reasoning, these aren't systems properties, they're human traits. We've made tremendous progress in the last decades in advancements in technology, whilst psychologists, behavioral economists, communications and linguistics experts have also unearthed an abundance of information that awaits our application. And now it's time that we looked more closely at our most precious resource, humans, and how we've evolved to behave. We don't have all the answers, as many of us in security like to think we do. And we don't have the luxury of time of reinventing the wheel. But we also don't need to. The healthcare and aviation industries have gone there before us, and they are literally lighting the path for us. Even Bruce Schneier now says, if you think technology can solve your problems, then you don't understand the problems and you don't understand the technology. Our jobs are not to focus on technology. They are to make sure our businesses can keep on keeping on. And if we are serious about securing business continuity, we need to keep in mind that technology is not a panacea. We need that three-legged, equilateral golden triangle to give equal attention to people and processes and technology. Because when it comes to the human operating system, MC Hammer said it best. You can't tech this. Thanks.
Brilliant conclusion. I love this. Thank you very much. Somebody has a question on this? Closing remark? Bernhard, please. Can we have a microphone in the first row here?
Thank you so much for your presentation. Exciting to listen to you. My point is that I perceive the young people below 25 that they require to have a complete no-blame culture. And this includes no blame of repetition of errors several times and so on. And if you could state how you see this with no blame culture and improvement culture.
Thank you very much, Professor, and I think that's a really important point to make. Although I'm very sad to not be included in the young category, but that's all right.
But you are.
So having a culture that's not focused on blaming and scapegoating individuals and rather looking at root cause analyses of problems does not mean that we can't be 100% committed to professional excellence. It also doesn't mean that we can't have accountability. In the aviation industry, in the hospital health industry, there are absolutely professional standards to abide by. There are absolutely accountability mechanisms, and certainly the approach of the aviation industry to adopt a safety critical approach has not been to the detriment of accountability for true negligence and deliberate or willful mistakes, and same in the health industry. And it also hasn't seen a reduction in the commitment of professionals to the quality of their profession. And so I think that it's extraordinarily important when we do talk about this, and I will take that as a note to take away for myself if I ever talk about this again, which is that when we talk about not blaming individuals, that we also talk about the importance of keeping people held to a very high professional standard and making sure that we still do have accountability mechanisms in place. So thank you very much, and I hope I've answered your question.
Good.
I think that's one up there.
Take another one? Yeah, there at the back, and then I think we have somebody waiting for us. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. Two perspectives on the example you gave with the pilots. So I like it. On the other hand, what we have to admit that is a pilot on average only spends 700 hours per year flying. So I spend around about 2,000 hours, sometimes even more per year working, which means he spends around 1,000 hours on preparation, debriefing, and training. So I think everybody here on the security side really wants people to train more, but whenever we do this, we have to talk about productivity, right? We are far from having our people in the company 50% being trained. of their time being there. We have productivity of 99% sometimes. Yeah. I have a workforce that is allowed to do 5 hours training per year sometimes. So I like it, but on the other hand, right, it's not on our hand to change that.
Thanks so much for your comment. So I think I very much understand and agree, and I also see the point you make about the need for being pragmatic and the realities in our industry of CISOs and SOC teams and so forth working really ridiculous hours, and also not having the quotas or the number of hours that we would want to train people, not having that available. I would say two things. I actually do think that it is well within our industry's power to push for change. And I think that we already have some anchors that we can use, and I'll talk very briefly about those. So let me first address the comment regarding the number of hours that SOC teams and CISOs work as opposed to pilots. So the NIST special procedures, off the top of my head, I think it's number 800. I can't remember the exact file name, but it is focused on crisis resilience teams. It actually does talk about the need for organizations to consider periods of rest for people on SOC teams to roll on and off, to consider food and shelter for them during an incident response. And also, there is an ISO standard that, or guideline, I believe it is, that also refers to similar provisions and talks about well-being of security industry professionals. We are also seeing movements and developments, let's say, in the industry. Particularly, I'm aware of movements in the UK to develop an industry standards body to push for the well-being of CISOs, recognising that, for instance, burnout is in some instances exceeding that of frontline healthcare workers, which is compounding this the cybersecurity challenges we face when you also couple that with the shortage in talent and an expanding threat surface. So there are movements being made to push for regulations to require certain hours and considerations for the well-being and performance of SOC teams and CISOs. And I think that is something that we as an industry should get behind, because I'm sure we all know someone who's been really struggling with the demands of the profession. To answer your second point about training, similarly, we're also seeing regulatory developments, for example, the NIS2 directive that's also requiring certain training be imposed in organisations. They want to now see what are you actually doing towards building resilience in your organisations. And of course, that needs to be balanced with business practicalities and realities, which is that not all organisations, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, can afford to devote the kinds of levels of training that we might need to see. But look, the aviation industry has done it, and I don't see why we should think that we can't do it in ours too, to some degree. You know, pilots are also working for commercial enterprises, and we've seen some of the safety developments there that have, as I said, you know, they look at the interconnecting outcomes of performance and well-being. We know that stress impacts the decisions we make and that can drive up cybersecurity risk. So I think it becomes absolutely central to looking at individual resilience when we're managing organizational cyber resilience. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Round of applause for Yanya.
Thank you.
Great talk.
Oh, thank you so much.
That
That's
was
very
a
kind.
chocolate.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.